Ukrainian drones strike a Russian convoy, and the eruption that followed split the valley open like a pressure-sealed chamber, breaking all at once. At 4:28 a.m., the Seversky corridor glowed with a sudden burst, a detonation rising nearly 40 meters into the cold air as metal fragments scattered across a 300-meter stretch of road. What looked like a single impact was only the opening signal. Above the flames, reconnaissance feeds captured thermal signatures multiplying, each spike revealing more hidden cargo. Artillery frames, command racks, and fuel carriers woven into a formation meant to vanish before daylight. But the strike didn't scatter them. It exposed them. And the chain of events set off in those first seconds would reshape the entire morning across the frontier. Before we continue deeper, if you saw that first explosion rip through the valley, what would you think was coming next? 4:28 a.m., and the Bryansk tree line detonated in a burst of light that didn't belong to dawn. A Ukrainian OD-4 Scout, no heavier than 5 pounds, was carving a silent arc above the canopy when the first missile rose to meet it. A Panzer launcher hidden under camouflage netting fired a 57-kilogram interceptor, punching through the cold air at almost 3,000 feet per second. The hit was brutal. The sky cracked, a white sphere expanding like a ruptured star. To the Russians below, it looked decisive, clean, flawless, final. But the blast was only the beginning. 200 milliseconds before disintegrating, the OD-4 had already transmitted a full geomesh of the forest road, truck spacing, axle heat signatures, escort formation depth, even the cadence of convoy radio bursts bouncing across the valley. The missile erased the drone, but not its mission. 3 minutes earlier, far above Earth, the first warning had surfaced. A commercial American satellite passing over the port of Zarubino logged an anomaly. A rectangular heat cluster measuring 37 by 14 meters, too uniform to be civilian cargo. In the next sweep, the cluster multiplied. 28 containers, sealed under reinforced lattice frameworks. Codes on their sides matched a restricted Chinese weapons evaluation from the prior year. When the satellite completed its next rotation, 89 seconds later, the imagery was already streaming into Kyiv. Inside Ukraine's Joint Intelligence Command, Shadow Vector came online. It didn't read the photos like humans did. It calculated velocity thresholds, engine load curves, probable refuel arcs across 11,000 square miles of Russian territory. And within seconds, it outlined a westbound corridor leading directly to Bryansk. 3:41 a.m. Ukraine launched the OD-4 to confirm what the algorithm predicted. It never made it back. But its final transmission changed everything. 4:52 a.m. 24 minutes after the OD-4 Scout was erased, the forest should have returned to silence. But the data it left behind refused to fade. Inside Kyiv, Shadow Vector began stitching the drone's final frames into a predictive path, one stretching 61 miles across the Bryansk interior. And what the system built next shocked even the analysts watching it. Shadow Vector detected refuel intervals spaced precisely every 43 kilometers, convoy braking patterns lasting under 5 seconds, and escort chatter repeating at intervals too regimented to be accidental. It wasn't randomness, it was choreography. The kind performed only when cargo is critical. 3:59 a.m. A Whisper 19 surveillance drone, light, carbon-framed, with a wingspan barely wider than a dining table, ascended through the low fog. At 11,400 feet, it locked onto a faint thermal trace sliding through the trees. The convoy. 14 vehicles now, not 12. 2 additional trucks had merged in, larger, heavier, radiating heat signatures consistent with long-range fire control systems. Ukraine needed confirmation, so they sent a test. 6 micro FPVs skimmed across the tree line, each the size of a soda can. Their purpose wasn't destruction, it was measurement. How fast would Russian countermeasures react? How tightly did the escorts protect the formation? Could Ukraine slip something larger through later? The answers came fast. 2 FPVs were neutralized instantly by an LPD-902 jammer. 3 more lost navigation as an Orlan 30 swept the grid with broadband interference. Only 1 made contact, clipping a support truck and igniting a brief harmless flare. To you watching, what would you have done here? Push harder or pull back and wait for the perfect moment? Ukraine chose the latter because Shadow Vector was still calculating, still reconstructing, still predicting the exact junction where the convoy would have no room to scatter. And that moment becomes the heart of Chapter 3. 5:21 a.m. The Seversky Valley ruptured in a shock of light that cut through the pre-dawn haze. The first blast expanded upward in a wide rolling pulse, its shimmer captured by a reconnaissance drone orbiting at 13,800 feet. The pressure wave traveled through the narrow basin at hundreds of meters per second, shaking dust from the cliff faces before fading into the darkness. The assault was underway barely 90 seconds earlier. 32 Ukrainian FPVs had begun their descent from layered altitudes, some dropping from 600 feet, others diving from above 2,300 feet. Their trajectories formed the erratic pattern known as Ghost Spiral, a design that splintered radar tracking into harmless noise. Tor M2 operators saw only fleeting specks, each appearing for less than 2 seconds before vanishing again. The convoy remained oblivious. 7 long-range artillery platforms, fresh Chinese-built units weighing more than 27 tons, advanced in a compressed formation along the valley floor. The 14-vehicle column emitted a contiguous thermal band stretching over 200 meters, visible even through dense tree cover. 8 ammunition vehicles followed, each carrying close to 2 tons of propellant. 4 coordination trucks closed the line, transmitting heartbeat signals across a restricted 5 kHz channel. The FPVs struck in unison, traveling at 119 miles per hour. Each drone drove its charge into a targeted weak point. Fuel linkages, hydraulic circuits, sensor clusters, power modules. A chain of secondary blasts followed as internal systems failed, throwing arcs of debris across 30 to 50 meters of terrain. 2 coordination trucks lost all output instantly. 3 ammunition carriers erupted in bright flashes, casting long shadows onto the ridge walls. Then comes the quiet origin of the strike. 5:17 a.m. Inside a concealed BTR-70 overlooking the valley, the Ukrainian operator monitored telemetry cascading across his displays. Shadow Vector had calculated a confinement interval of 5 minutes and 19 seconds, the span during which the convoy would be trapped inside the 180-meter-wide corridor with no lateral escape paths. All variables aligned. Now, less than 4 minutes after launch, the valley floor was an unbroken line of disabled vehicles. Frames bent under stress. Communication racks collapsed. Gu Shadow Vector Reg Primary Saint. 5:34 a.m. and the Seversky Valley had gone strangely still. The echoes from the detonations had faded, leaving only the soft hiss of cooling metal and the intermittent crackle from damaged circuitry. Smoke lifted in thin vertical sheets, drifting upward until the shifting wind carried it toward the eastern ridge. From above, the valley looked like a fractured corridor, 17 vehicles immobilized across a stretch of nearly 300 meters. But the destruction on the ground was only the first layer of the operation's impact. At the Bryansk command relay, 26 miles north, the initial shock arrived as a sudden data interruption. 3 communication nodes tied to the convoy dropped offline simultaneously. Automated diagnostics attempted reconnection at 2-second intervals, then widened the cycle to 5 seconds when the error persisted. By the time the system flagged a full disconnect, nearly 49 seconds had passed, enough for Shadow Vector to intercept auxiliary broadcasts and map the confusion building across the region. Inside the relay center, operators watched as map overlays blinked from green to gray. Signal paths diverged, then collapsed entirely. Backup channels survived only in fragments. Partial coordinates, static pulses, distorted telemetry. The entire sector's command structure had weakened in less than a minute. At the same time, Seismic monitors positioned along the forest perimeter registered vibration patterns from the detonations, spikes reaching 0.8 on the local scale, brief but strong enough to be misinterpreted as long-range strikes by analysts unfamiliar with the valley's acoustics. False alarms spread outward, triggering defensive postures from outposts up to 12 miles away. Meanwhile, reconnaissance teams moving toward the valley reported heat signatures lingering longer than expected. Calculations estimated residual engine warmth to remain detectable for over 17 minutes, delaying search efforts and causing patrols to circle the area twice before approaching. For Ukraine, the valley strike wasn't merely tactical. It disrupted tempo. It fractured communication. It forced the enemy to reorient its entire morning response, and Shadow Vector was already predicting where the next gap would open. 6:04 a.m., and Bryansk's regional network was still struggling to regain coherence. What had begun as a localized disruption in a forest valley was now rippling through a command grid that supported over 120 military nodes. Each system attempted to compensate, rerouting, recalculating, shifting load. But the damage pattern didn't match anything in their protocols. It wasn't jamming, it wasn't cyber intrusion, it was absence. A sudden vacuum in the middle of their logistical map. By 6:08 a.m., command analysts finally pieced together the first fragments of truth. The convoy's telemetry had not simply vanished, it had collapsed across multiple channels at the exact same second. A statistically improbable event. Less than 0.009% under normal battlefield conditions. That probability alone forced senior staff to reevaluate the situation with a sharper, more urgent lens. Shadow Vector tracked every response. Repositioned patrols began fanning outward from 3 staging areas: Kovalyovka, Yampol, and Starodub. Each deploying with incomplete intelligence movement logs showed convoys reducing their spacing to under 20 meters, a defensive posture that slowed supply speed by almost 60%. Fuel consumption rose accordingly, widening resupply intervals from 2 hours to nearly 3.5. Radio monitoring stations along the frontier recorded a spike in encrypted traffic. 47 transmissions in a span where typical activity averaged 7 patterns suggested heightened internal concern, especially over equipment recently transferred from foreign partners. Officers questioned whether their newest assets had been compromised before ever reaching operational range. In Kiev, none of this went unnoticed. Shadow Vector plotted the shifts in real time, circles tightening around predicted fallback points. Transport lanes thinning to half their usual density, escort units dispersing across wider territory in an attempt to shield the remaining flows of hardware. The model displayed it clearly. Russia's supply rhythm had fractured. The tempo that once fed the front was now irregular, stretched, vulnerable, and as the system lit up with the next set of projections, the outline for what would happen in Chapter 6 began forming. Another fault line emerging just beyond the morning haze. 6:39 a.m. The aftershocks of the valley strike were no longer confined to Bryansk. They had begun radiating outward across an entire segment of the front. Reports filtered into regional headquarters with a lag averaging 8 minutes, triple the normal delay. Dozens of units waited for instructions that never arrived, their orders trapped in fragmented transmissions bouncing between overloaded antenna relays. Shadow Vector mapped the deterioration with clinical precision. At the Kupiansk axis, nearly 80 miles from the strike zone, Russian artillery output dropped by 39% within the first hour. Batteries that typically fired in coordinated clusters of 12 volleys now struggled to deliver half that number. Logistical logs revealed the cause. Without the destroyed reinforcement package, the remaining batteries were forced to conserve ammunition, stretching their supply cycle from 7 hours to nearly 12. Reconnaissance flights detected another shift. Armored groups repositioning near Lyman slowed to an average of 11 miles per hour, well below their usual rate. Fuel convoys that should have arrived before sunrise were stalled along secondary routes, forced into detours that added 16 to 21 extra kilometers per movement. Each change compounded another, creating a cascade of delays that widened across the operational map like cracks in frozen ground. Even the electronic spectrum reflected the strain. Intercept stations documented a surge of encrypted attempts to reconnect severed links. 112 attempts in a window where the baseline hovered near 15 analysts flagged an unusual rise in command queries concerning system reliability and foreign origin platforms. A cautious terminology masking deeper uncertainty about assets recently transferred from abroad. Through all of it, Shadow Vector continued its quiet analysis. The system projected that within 45 to 50 minutes, disruptions would force 3 Russian sectors to shift from offensive posture to stabilization mode, reducing their capacity to maneuver along a front stretching nearly 32 miles. The Valley strike had not merely neutralized a convoy, it had bent the rhythm of an entire battlefield, altering timing, disrupting tempo, and exposing structural vulnerabilities that were never meant to be seen. And in Kiev, planners already understood what the new tempo meant for the hours to come. By sunrise, the valley was silent, but the consequences kept spreading. Slower convoys, fractured signals, and an entire sector forced to reset its rhythm. Ukraine didn't win through volume, it won through timing. And now I'm curious, which moment in this operation stood out to you the most? Tell me below. Your insight shapes the next episode.